You have the high-minded Chassidic idea, or you have Elokus, and it's transcendent and spiritual. But what does it look like in your messy human experience? And that, in that way, I think sometimes poetry could be a documentation, a recording of the Dir B'Tachtonim. Poetry does speak about personal things, or does speak about potentially embarrassing things. That's true, but my feeling is that that's the Tachton Shein Tachton L'Mata Mimena. That is the ultimate low, those embarrassing or difficult moments, and to persevere through them is to make the Dir B'Tachtonim. You know, there's been times where some people said, "Why don't you work on translation to the Frierdiker Rebbe Sichos?" And I asked my mashpia, and they said, "No, you have to go much farther down."
Welcome to Homesick for Lubavitch, a podcast where we explore Lubavitch identity in the year 2025. My name is Bosi Lgani, and I will be your host. Let's begin. Alrighty, we are here on this wonderful winter afternoon in Teaneck, New Jersey, with an old-time acquaintance and friend, and in many ways a mentor. Rabbi? How do you go by?
Yehoshua.
Just plain Yehoshua November, who is well known as a poet, published poet, has released, I think now 3 collections of poetry, and I'm not going to say that I'm a big time connoisseur of poetry, but I've read quite a bit. I would say, at least relative to most yeshiva boys. I think definitely, especially the more kind of modern, free flowing poetry, and it's really not. It was really nice when I first came across your poetry to see someone who was, really using literature to the best of their ability, and in a very beautiful and heartfelt, touching way, but talking about things that meant something to me personally. Like, I could see myself in a lot of them. Maybe not in the tattoo in the mikveh, but many of them were like, oh, I could see myself in that. And very often I personally don't find that. Poetry written by, I think there was one that you recommended to me, Adam Zagajewski, a wonderful Polish poet. Wonderful poetry, but most of it has nothing to do, in a personal way with my life. Anyway, so thank you very much for coming on the pod. Quite a few listeners have actually asked me to have you on, and so I'm glad that we could make it work.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So before we go further, I just want to ask everyone. I always forget to do this, so we may as well start at this point. 50-some episodes in, but if you're listening or watching on YouTube or Spotify, please subscribe, and or please follow. And if you're up to it or you've been thinking about it, please go to the website hflpodcast.com/donate to help support this podcast. All right. Why don't we begin with a little bit of background, who you are, and where do you come from, sir?
Where do I come from? It's a long and winding path. Well, I was born in Miami Beach, Florida, which I think contributed to my fashion sense.
Sweaters?
Yeah, no, I'm just joking. But my family moved around a lot. I was born in Miami Beach. My father was in residency there. And then soon after, we moved to Richmond, Virginia, Kansas City, Scranton, Minnesota, Pittsburgh. And it was only later, after I was married, actually, that my father joined the military.
Yeah, so why did you move around so long?
Well, so my father was an OBGYN, and so part of the time he was in residency, medical school. And then really, he was looking for, him and my mother were looking for the ideal kind of Jewish community, Jewish education. He grew up in Brooklyn, pretty traditionally. My mother, a little bit less so in Pittsburgh. She grew up. So they got married right after college, and they kind of were on a journey, and they were never, I guess, completely satisfied wherever we were, especially educationally. So we were kind of moving around from place to place. And then, and I myself, I would say, went to various different kinds of educational institutions.
Right.
So, for example, when we were in Scranton, that was a kind of like a Lakewood satellite community.
Sure.
And that was to the Scranton Hebrew Day School. And then we moved to Minnesota. It was more of a kind of like co-ed school, Jewish school Torah academy. And
so you were really moving each community just in search of a school.
School and jobs for my father. And then we moved to Pittsburgh. I went to a school called Hillel, like a kind of modern Orthodox school. And then I went for 1 year. I didn't quite make it the whole year to Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva in Rochester.
Okay.
Then from there, I came back and went to public school the last 2.5 years. Then I went to Yeshiva Kotel. It was like a modern Orthodox yeshiva in Israel. Then I went to Binghamton University, where I became close with the Slonims.
Sure.
Shluchim there. And I met my wife there.
In Binghamton.
In Binghamton, we actually, the first Shabbos, the Chabad house, we sat next to each other, across from each other. And then we got married right after college, and we moved back to Pittsburgh. And I pursued an MFA in creative writing, Master of Fine Arts in Poetry, graduate school. And my wife was in graduate school for social work. And at that time, we tried to go when we moved to Pittsburgh to kind of like the regular Orthodox shuls, but it just didn't really speak to us or resonate very much, I guess, coming from the Chabad house in Binghamton. So we started to go to the Chabad shul in Pittsburgh. And that was probably my first serious encounter with learning Chassidus.
Oh, not Binghamton.
Binghamton a little bit, but not so intensely there. Although I was very close with the Slonims. Every Shabbos, every morning we go to shul there.
Right.
But really learning Chassidus, I would say, more in Pittsburgh. And simultaneously, I was in graduate school, which were two very different worlds.
Oh, very interesting.
When I was an undergrad in Binghamton, I studied under several professors who were very encouraging and warm and supportive. And some of them even came to our wedding, right? They traveled down from Binghamton to Brooklyn to go to our wedding, my wife and I's wedding. And then graduate school felt like a kind of different atmosphere. It was a little bit more competitive. It was smaller. And I really kind of encountered more of a literary life, like people going to bars all the time, all my classmates, and living like the literary culture, and
a lot of cigarettes.
And I was just gotten married. I didn't feel quite at home in that environment. Although I had some really great teachers. One of my teachers is one of the most famous contemporary American poets. His name is Tony Hoagland, passed away recently. But I had certain negative encounters. There were some conflicts about Israel. Professors were kind of anti-Israel. One professor asked us to write an anti-Israel poem, and I kind of got in a disagreement with him. And he kicked me out of his office. And it's just a very small program, so it was kind of uncomfortable. But at the same time, as I was having those experiences of writing poetry and not quite fitting in graduate school, I encountered Chassidus, and I became more and more engrossed in it, in the stories and in learning Chassidus. I remember actually we had like a small little.
What did it mean for you to? Sorry, what did it mean for you to like encounter Chassidus? Like, because it sounds like you had a bit of a yeshiva background. Right?
Yeah,
you had learned Gemara before.
Right. So
you were starting off with like Chassidus essays online, like English interpretations, or you were straight at the text. Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, there were shiurim, and Pittsburgh is a pretty relatively large Chabad community. So
Right.
there were shiurim. I was learning with people. Rabbi Roth. My wife and I learned Tanya with Rabbi Rothman. I learned with Rabbi Darren on Shabbos morning. there were a lot of shirim, and I was doing like mashkiach work. I was hanging out a lot with Rabbi Itkin, who passed away, Alav Shalom.
Sure.
And he was really a great person to spend time with, just to be in his to be in his company. It was kind of an education in what it means to be a chassid itself. Yeah. But I remember distinctly, we had like a small basement apartment in Pittsburgh, and I was learning Tanya, probably like a translation or something like that. And I just remember distinctly learning this idea that that the creation comes about through Hashem's speech, His constant speech, recreating the world. And I remember hearing that concept and thinking that there's Devar Havai, there's the divine speech is invested in each item in creation. And I kind of remember like looking around and feeling a little bit dizzy, because it was just so disorienting to me. It was so foreign relative to what I had ever learned before. I always thought of there being a God, a transcendent, distant God, and then there's the physical world, which is its own solid, independent mass, right. And the two really are not interconnected in any kind of meaningful way, and definitely not one.
Right.
So I remember learning that concept and just feeling very, literally actually feeling kind of dizzy, like the apartment was spinning a little bit. And I wouldn't consider myself a mystical person, but I remember having that sensation. I think that the Judaism...
Who you were learning it with, by yourself?
I was just learning by myself. I think that the Judaism that I had known up until that point was largely Judaism that seemed almost like a video game to me, like where there's the idea that you do as many mitzvahs as you can, learn as much Torah, and you get a great seat in heaven. It almost sounded like a video game. Like you get extra lives and you amass points. And if you're good at playing the video game, then there'll be this kind of delayed gratification reward. So that really kind of made Judaism for me. I think I've always believed, I believed in the Torah Sinai, Rashi, wrote the Gemara, but it didn't really speak to me as a human being, who I am, as I am. And I think that's probably why I got so interested in literature, because literature was always telling the human story,
right,
and speaking about relationships. And halacha was just kind of technical and lacking in human touch. So I think that literature for me filled the void that I felt from learning just merely Gemara or halacha or even Musar. So I think that's what drew me to literature, and I started writing poetry, and because I was supported by my professors.
And you were drawn to poetry also?
I read a lot of novels, but I also was writing poetry. Poetry seemed to me to be very compelling because you're able to compress in such a small space so much information, and so much of a life can fit onto into a few small lines.
Right.
So that was very magnetic to me. I also, like most teenagers, I probably felt a little bit alienated and desiring connection to other people, and I always felt like a poem is a great way to a great way to share yourself with somebody else. You could share a poem with them, and they would have a pretty good sense of who you are just through a poem.
Right.
Poetry has that kind of poignancy, and it's so much is compressed in that small space. So that part of what drew me to poetry. I felt there was some kind of authenticity to poetry, and some kind of a poignancy that's unparalleled in other art forms. And that's really I think that a lot of people feel that poetry fills a spiritual void for them, especially people who are agnostic or consider themselves non-believers. They do get a very deep sense of humanity and inspiration from reading poetry, which like affirms the value of kindness or affirms that there's meaning in the ordinary passing moment.
Right. So you said something interesting before, that Gemara and Halacha was made you feel like you needed to fill a void with literature, right? So you have like the more, I guess, you have literature, and then on the other side you have let's call non-literature, or something that's more, what would you say, more factual, more logical, as opposed
Or,
to
technical.
more technical. Where do you put Chassidus? Is Chassidus literature in your mind?
Well,
Where did you put it?
I think I remember first studying the Kutei Sichos and thinking it was very profound. Almost similar in certain senses. At the time, I thought this because that's what I was probably studying. Looking at literary criticism, like professors who are critiquing literature, not in terms of its value, but what is the underlying meaning?
Right.
What is the symbolism? What are the themes that run through a work? And I remember like learning sichas and seeing how the Rebbe's weaving together from different, from Shad, Rebbe's just so different realms of Torah, and thinking how it surpasses the literary criticism, but at least at that moment, thinking there is some kind of similarity in this very deep and rich analysis. Now I would say that Chassidus is the fifth darga, the fifth level, and it corresponds to the Yechidah Shabbat, and it's something really just on another plane of reality. It's the essence. It comes from God's essence, and it is the essence, and it awakens the Yechidah. So, I mean, once you learn that that's how it's classified and defined in Chassidic literature, it's hard to compare it. And of course, once you define yourself as a chassid, are you trying to live as a chassid? It seems inappropriate to compare it to literary criticism, but to the Rebbe's sichas. But I do remember feeling that parallel.
My question, I guess, is
Yeah.
my question is: does Chassidus fill that void that literature is filling?
It was an interesting story. Once I mentioned the poet Tony Hoagland. He once asked me to bring him to shul.
Was he Jewish?
No, he was not a Jewish person. He was really probably agnostic at best. He was really kind of, his writing is very ironic. He does a lot of like cultural criticism. He was a brilliant poet, and he wrote about poetry very brilliantly and observantly. But he asked me, for some reason, he wanted to come to shul. So it was Friday night. I brought him to shul on Kabbalah Shabbos, and it was the Chabad shul. And then we were walking home, and for some reason, I asked him, "Could you ever imagine not writing poetry? Could you ever imagine if you just stop writing poetry?" And interestingly, he said to me, he's like, "Well, if I had the imagination of the men who I saw tonight in that room in the shul, then maybe I could stop writing poetry," really? Which was a shocking thing that he said. And he didn't mean imagining that they're imagining there's a God. He meant that they have some kind of spirituality to them. They're experiencing something that's unseen. I think that's what he meant. And if he had that, then maybe he wouldn't feel a need to write poetry.
So he was moved by what he saw.
He was moved by what he saw. And other times he had criticism about it. but so...
Sounds like one of us.
Yeah. So I think learning Chassidus has many purposes. There's the Sikha, the Rebbe quotes the Friedrich Rebbe about how you could learn Sikha, learning Chassidus is like going to the coal mine and getting out the coals, and it's also like going deep sea diving for pearls.
Right.
And the idea of the coal mine is that you need coal; it's a staple of life to provide warmth and light. So I think Chassidus, on the one hand, just helps the Jew get through life in an idealistic fashion and puts them above the maze. It's just a necessity,
right.
On the one hand. And then the pearls in that Sikha, the Rebbe said, is like more like somebody who's learning a lot of Chassidus, like it's a luxury. It's like an indulgence. But right before Yemos Mashiach, when Jewish people are chassid, then they have to wear pearls to the Chassidus. So they have to learn a lot of Chassidus. They have to be like swallowed in Chassidus, just like the pearls are in the ocean, and the ocean is the water's covering the whole expanse. So I think Chassidus is, on the one hand, necessary just to get through your day as a idealistic, committed Jew. And then on the other hand, I think it provides this overarching perspective of what the world is and what God is, and is deeply meaningful. Would I need to write poetry? Could I stop writing poetry? Probably not. I probably would want to write poetry, but what a lot of times what ends up happening is that it could be moved by an idea in Chassidus and then want to express it in poetry more like organically, not like that I want to teach somebody a lesson.
This week's episode is brought to you by This World is a Garden, a new film and concert production by Yuvla Media. Based on the Rebbe's first talk, Bosi Lgani, the production tells the story of the Chabad vision lasting over 300 years, to see this world as God sees it, as His garden. Combining beautiful cinematography with a live performance of a string quartet, This World is a Garden is a meditation on hope and holding on to a vision as time passes by. This production is now available to be shown at your Chabad house and community. Share the message and vision of Bosi Lgani with your community in a way you never have before. For more information, please visit thisworldisagarden.com. So why is that? That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not trying to. I'm not trying to push you into a corner.
No,
like,
it's okay.
No. But I'm not trying.
Why do you're asking? Why do I write poetry? Why is there a need to write poetry?
No, not precisely. I'm not trying to say is Chassidus literature.
Oh, okay.
I accept that Chassidus is bigger than literature. I'm not trying to. But does it fill that void of literature? Which, like in a way, like you're saying, if like you were saying earlier. Yeah. Because you were learning Gemara and Halacha, you felt that you needed literature to fill up the more personal, alienated part of yourself. If you had been learning Chassidus, or today you are learning Chassidus, do you still feel, without literature, alienated, lonely, in need of this kind of tool, this powerful tool that you described as, in your case, poetry, to connect?
Yeah. I don't actually really read very much literature anymore.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's a conscious choice. I just don't have that much time. I'm reading my students' papers, grading my students' essays and poems itself, and then trying to learn and teach Chassidus.
You teach Chassidus as part of your job?
Not as part of my job. I teach like a Sikha Shir Sunday night at my home, and in the morning before davening at the Chabad house, I teach Chassidus. So in the Shabbos morning, just as at the Chabad house, but and so I just don't really have that much time to read novels.
For sure.
I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm against that. I mean, I'm a professor of writing, creative writing, so I really can't go on record saying I'm against that.
Why do you write? But you write fair, but you write poetry.
So writing is a little bit different than reading, also, I think. But I would say that
in a way, it's hyper reading. You have to read what you write, what you've read. I don't know, 100 times.
I would say when I have more time, I would say I enjoy learning Chassidus, but I do feel that I need to write.
Why?
And I think a lot of poets will tell you that it's not really a choice. Writing is not really a choice. When I feel overwhelmed by life, or when I feel joyously overwhelmed by life, then it kind of just it gushes out. I actually find it hard to write poetry.
Really?
I'm not a very disciplined person. I don't have like set times where I write poetry. I have to really push myself to do it, or life will overwhelm me enough, and I'll just kind of be moved to write.
Feel a need.
But I'm not a good example of a disciplined artist. again, I think a lot of times I'm very busy teaching and doing other things, but I do feel an obligation to write poetry. I do feel, for myself personally, that I should be writing poetry, and that it's healthy to write poetry. And then I guess I at a certain point I felt like.
But why
This
is
is
the question? But why is the question?
why? Yeah,
But, I mean,
No, that's a fair question.
Let me open up the question first. Just
Yeah,
let me just set it up for you.
Yeah.
You know, because a lot of times, especially in Chabad conversation, there's this kind of accepted dichotomy of, you know, the Lubavitcher, you know, as he said, the kind of native Lubavitcher, let's say, and then there's the Baal Tshuva, or the person who became Lubavitcher later on in life. And one of the characteristics of that split is that, yes, the person who came from whichever background, he needs literature because that was his background, that was his job, his upbringing, whatever. But the native Lubavitcher, he's got no need for that, whatever, you know, and so I'm not even saying right or wrong here. I'm not trying to say one side is right or wrong, but a lot of times it becomes like a conversation. Well, the reason he writes poetry, or the reason, you know,
I see what you're saying.
It's because that's how he was brought up. But it's not.
I remember actually when I was in yeshiva, one of the rabbis said, "Oh, maybe you have like." Maybe you have some kind of psychological need to do it, almost implying there's something psychologically wrong with you.
Yes.
You have to do it.
Yes. By the way, every rabbi in yeshiva I've come to believe is a wannabe Freud.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is, I remember being in a Chassidic shir one time, and it was Rebbe Dubinsky's shir, and
this is Tiferes.
And strangely, he said, "Okay, close the sefer and write down what the mimer means to you."
Right.
Which was a strange moment to me, because it just doesn't happen that often. But in a way, I think that's what poetry is doing, for me at least. Poetry is juxtaposing the words of the mimer with the actual life that I'm living. And a lot of times there's a big gap between the two, because Chassidus has very high bar. All Torah has a very high bar.
Right.
You're reading about exceptional personalities, and especially if you learn Chassidus, people without a Yetzer Hara. So it's a very, very high bar. You're learning about tzaddikim, rebbeim, and then there's you in your actual life, and then there's such a gap between those two things. Even if the Torah or the Chassidus is trying to speak to an ordinary person, I think no matter what, you come away thinking that this is a very high bar.
Yes.
And I think the Rebbeim are trying to speak to us as we are, but still it's a text, so it feels for some reason like a very high bar. And Chassidus has very high expectations of people.
I think there's also limitations. I think it's fair to say that there's limitations. There are certain things that a Rebbe can say in a mimer, and there's certain things he cannot say in a mimer. Right. A mimer, like, things have parameters, right? There are certain, and you see it. You see it very much in the Rebbe's Torah, where things that he said in the things that he wrote, for example, in the Igros, or he said in Yechidus, are not ever quoted in the mimer. They're never said in the mimer.
Right.
There are parameters here, right?
So I think poetry for me is the space to negotiate the distance,
right,
and to bridge the gap. And I think that that's very important, actually meaningful. I actually think that everybody would do well to write poetry.
Yes.
Just because it would be a way to process their lives and think a little bit more about their lives, and it's a kind of a concrete medium to do so. And I think that would be very helpful. It would help people internalize what they're learning. And so that's for me is what's happening in poem. But and in a certain way, I feel that I must have some kind of ability to do this, because I've had some degree of success, thank God, at it. So in that way, I kind of feel like it's a responsibility. But on the other hand, even
one second, responsibility to whom?
I guess as part of my tafkid, as part of my purpose in this world. If I, have that ability, that I should, it's my responsibility to use it.
Right.
Like, I definitely would feel guilty if I'm not if I don't write another book, I'm not writing poetry at all, if I gave it up, I would feel like I was not doing God justice. Like I was not fulfilling my tafkid. I would feel that. But the irony is, or the thing is, though, you can't, when you sit down to write a poem, say, I want to write a poem and share Chassidus.
Right.
Because a poem cannot be a lecture for various reasons, I think. One reason is that what a poem is often is an attempt to convey an experience. There's a famous poem, it's called an Ars Poetica poem. Ars Poetica poem is a poem that lays out a poetic philosophy. So there's a famous Ars Poetica poem by the poet named Archibald MacLeish, written in 1927. And at the end of the last two lines of the poem say, a poem should not mean but be. A poem should not mean but be. Which means to say, if you're having a meaning experience, it means you're trying to convey a message. Right. You have a point, you have a lesson you want to transmit. That's a meaning experience. A being experience means that you just allow the reader to share the experience that you had. And that's why oftentimes in a poem, or one of the fundamental rules of writing is show, don't tell. That's what creates the being versus meaning experience. Show, don't tell. Show means use images, but don't make a value assessment, a judgment assessment, and don't try to transmit a lesson. It's really the difference between Re'iyah and Shmiya in a lot of ways.
Yes. Is it
in Chachma and Bina, it harks back to that. But
that's a fascinating line, because it runs in many ways in such. To me, it's almost the difference between a good story and a lesson, right?
Right. Stories are so valuable because they're an actual experience in the world.
Right.
And they speak to us more directly.
And so in many ways, we value the lesson over the story. And there's reason, like, we can steelman that. We're like so much of learning Torah is transmitting meaning. You know, the transmission of seichel from the Rav to Talmud, from one person to another, sharing meaning, sharing ideas, right? But then there's this idea of Ma'aser Rav, that a story has everything, right? A story has like what you described, being, where a person just feels like they're in that space of the person in the story, and life becomes that much richer.
Right. And to do that, you have to use images, right, as opposed to abstractions. That's the lived experiences versus the theoretical. But in the poems, often we'll try to take an idea from Chassidus and then match it up with something that's going on in life. And I think that the thing about that is I think that is actually what a dir b'tachtonim means. Because I think that the dir b'tachtonim means, how did this apply in your personal life, in your daily experiences? You have the high-minded Chassidic idea, or you have Elokus, and it's transcendent and spiritual, but what does it look like in your messy human experience? And that, in that way, I think sometimes poetry could be a documentation, a recording of the dir b'tachtonim as it plays out in the individual's life. Sometimes people say,
music to my ears.
So sometimes, we were speaking about this a little earlier, sometimes people will say and ask me, your poetry does speak about personal things, or does speak about potentially embarrassing things. That's true. But my feeling is that that's the tachton she'en tachton l'mata mimena. That is the ultimate low, those embarrassing or difficult moments, and to persevere through them is to make the dir b'tachtonim. That's precisely what it's about. So I sometimes feel like poetry, because it's about life, is a good medium for kind of capturing what the dir b'tachtonim looks like in the actual world, in the actual experience of a human being.
Yes.
Whereas Chassidus is telling us how and what to do, and what the map is, what the what's the instruction book and what the world is really made of, what's the spiritual biology, but then it's up to us to kind of go and apply that in our lives. And it's going to look differently for each person by design, and to kind of record what it's like to go through life trying to be a frum Jew or a human being, applying these ideas and failing often, and feeling that there's sometimes a gap between the two, but persevering is in fact is the stuff of Dir B'Tachtonim.
Absolutely. Are you ever worried? Because I know in a lot of your poems, and we want to get to some of them soon, but I know that in some of your poems that I've read, you speak about not just embarrassing things like, let's say, a tattoo or whatever, but like doubts and like places of uncertainty, religious uncertainty, and so on. Are you ever worried, and maybe even less in those cases, but more in cases where you're trying to explain an idea in Chassidus, and maybe you connect it to a relationship, maybe with your wife or whatever, or maybe not, but you're taking an idea and trying to put it in your own words. Are you ever worried, maybe I'm getting this wrong?
No, because I think a poem is not a contract of truth. A poem is there's not an expectation that a poem is going to approximate truth. That's kind of, it goes with the territory. It's my attempt to render an experience. I could try to take a concept in Chassidus as I understand it and try to explore how I see it playing out in my personal experience, but I don't see myself as an authority. So I'm kind of free from that from that expectation, I think. Yeah, I mean, that's part of what's good about being able to be creative and to do creative writing. You don't have that kind of, no one is expecting absolute truth, and no one expecting you to necessarily be an expert in what you're writing.
But so let me tighten that question a little bit. You know, if you're a chossid, right? You're a Lubavitcher chossid. You're portraying Chassidus. You're not worried that someone is going to come and say, Yehoshua, you are putting things in the mouths of the Rebbeim that never happened. You are attributing to Chassidus your own fantasies, or you don't care.
I do care. I'm a sensitive person, and I think if somebody actually said that to me, I would take a while to recover. And I have a family, and I have children who are learning in Chabad yeshivas and so on and so forth. So I think there's a delicate balance. I don't really worry that much about being accurate in terms of because nobody's looking at I don't think people are looking at my poetry as a mimer. I did this event in the Five Towns on Motzei Shabbos, and somebody asked me, "Do you see your poetry as Torah?" And they said, because I do, I would never take it into the bathroom. So I said, that's the nicest thing anybody ever said to me. but I don't think of it like that. I guess I think that I'm borrowing from Chassidus, and then I'm trying to, again, like I've been saying, trying to explore how it might play out in a particular human being's life. So I don't feel that I am beholden to as a Chassidic guide. I don't see myself as that. I'm happy that when my Chassidus could help with the Fatzas HaMayanas, I'm happy about that, and I even maybe see that as a part of my responsibility as a Lubavitcher. But like I said before, you can never write a poem with that in mind. It's interesting. A very formative experience for me in terms of choosing what to do with my life. Once I was already into Ferris, and I had to kind of choose: did I want to get smicha and go into chinuch or shluchus, or become a professor in write poetry?
This was after the creative writing.
Yeah, degree. After I got my degree, I went to Teferis for 2 years.
So you'd already invested.
I got an MFA, a graduate degree in creative writing. That doesn't necessarily get you anywhere.
No, but it does incur. It's a lot of time and expense incurred.
And then I went to Teferis and learned Kol Teferis for 2 years. And then after that I had to decide what I want to do. And I actually, at that point, interestingly, my father just joined the army, and he was in basic training in Texas, and he was supposed to go to Italy. He was going to be stationed to kind of be an OBGYN for American soldiers in a base in Italy. And so he was stationed in Texas, and he was about to go overseas with my mother. And so for Pesach, we went to San Antonio, to Rabbi Bloch Chabad house, to stay there for Pesach. And Professor Bloch was there.
Sure.
And I met him, and we talked a lot. And he told me a story, a really fascinating story, about how he grew up in Tennessee, and he wasn't from, but he met Ray Posner, and then he was supposed to go for a PhD in Harvard in philosophy, and but Ray Posner said, "That's fine, but why don't you go to 770 the summer before?" And this is like the 1950s.
Right.
And he did go for a summer. And at first he said he got there, and it was so off-putting because it was a small room, and everybody was smoking, and there was two fans, one on either side of the room, and the smoke would be blown to one side, and then the other fan would blow the other smoke to the other side. And the bathroom was filthy. So he said he called his mother, and he said, "I got to get out of here." And he said his mother, who wasn't from at the time, saved him, because she said, "You came all this way, and you're going to let this ruin it. Why don't you just give it a fair shake? Give it a fair chance." So he stayed, and he ended up really taking to it and immersing it in learning Chassidus and Gemara. And then it came time to go to Harvard. I think he was studying Greek philosophy. And he said when he got there, he told me, he just felt so out of place and truly alienated, and he was doing poorly, and eventually decided, "I'm going to just check out and go back to 770." And he did. And of course his friends would welcomed him and embraced him. That this is obviously a good choice when it comes to studying Chassidus or Greek philosophy. It's an obvious choice. And the Rosh Yeshiva told him to say, but he said just go to get the Rebbe's Askama, go to. So he went to the Rebbe's office, and he told the Rebbe that I'm leaving Harvard. I want to stop studying philosophy. I want to join the yeshiva. And he said the Rebbe looked at him and said, "I think you better think about your career and go back to Harvard." So that was a very interesting story for me to hear, right when I was kind of trying to choose what I should do. And it was, kind of academia or doing something in the Jewish world. And he also said to me, I think this is relevant to what I was saying earlier, he said that one time he went for dollars, and the Rebbe said, he told the Rebbe, "I really enjoy learning Chassidus." He said the Rebbe shook his head, and he said, "But I do actually like philosophy too." And he said the Rebbe also shook his head to that, which was a very fascinating story. That I felt like is an interesting thing for me to hear at a crossroads in my life, and I felt that was informative and helpful. And I had some mashpia that said, stay within the world of the Olam HaTorah. You could go into chinuch and you'll go Michal Chayil. And then others said, well, like Rebbe Slonim said to me, that there are certain people that if you're a professor, you'll meet people and influence people that no rabbi would ever meet or influence. And they also quoted the end of Perek Tanya, talking about the Ramban, that they were able to use secular wisdom to earn a parnasa, and also you could do it if you know how to use it to serve Hashem. So that was helpful to me, and actually everything kind of came full circle then, because that presented to me a Yiddishkeit that wasn't small and defensive and just waiting for the next life. It was kind of saying Yiddishkeit is broad enough that you could actually be a poet or be a professor and still be a chossid.
Right, but push comes to shove. You can't, I understand these stories, but
right. The reason why I wanted to tell you the story about Professor Bloch is because you can't write a poem You can't write a poem if you don't like poetry. You can't write a poem because you want to use it solely as a vehicle for Hafatzas Mayonis. You have to like poetry,
Right.
and you have to have something to say about life from an authentic place in yourself if it's going to resonate with somebody else. You can't be
Right.
using it as a vehicle to lecture.
Yeah.
So I do like poetry, and when I write a poem, even if I am sharing an idea in Chassidus, I'm not sharing it in such a way that I want people to know this. They should know this information. I'm sharing it. This is something that I love, and it's precious to me, and it moves me in my life. I sometimes struggle to practice it or to fully utilize it, and this is what it looks like in my life.
Right.
But you cannot. So I think when the Rebbe said, shook his head when he said, I like philosophy also, for me that meant, in my life, you have to like poetry. You can't just use it as a vehicle.
Right. Homesick for Lubavitch is brought to you by Yuvla Media, a boutique video production company servicing the Chabad and Jewish community. Since opening 10 years ago, Yuvla Media has pushed the boundaries of artistic and thoughtful storytelling in the community, with an insistence on there always being a memorable story as well as a beautiful and striking visual image that we believe is second to none. Over the years, we have worked with Chabad organizations around the country, as well as large organizations like Boni Olam, Torah Masora, and Atzalathon, guided by the belief that your story is absolutely worth telling with depth and creativity. If you are looking to tell your story with a video, please reach out to us at hello@yuvlamedia.com. Again, that is hello@yuvlamedia.com. A link can be found in the show notes. And now, back to the podcast. Yes, that is such a interesting point for me. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, but there's sometimes this idea that Hafatzas Mayonis is like is the end that we're gunning for, and then we use all these other tools as means towards the end. We're like let's use poetry to get to the poetry community. Let's use academia to get to the academic community. Let's use film. I do film. Let's use film to get to these people. And at the end of the day, anybody that's in these spaces, especially someone like yourself who has spent so many years learning it under people who have spent their lives doing it, you have to respect the medium. If you disrespect the medium, it will disrespect you back. It's just how it works, right? Yeah. You cannot just use it for your own ends. You have to respect it. And I'm not trying to get now into like some kind of tussle with people who, it's just on its own, it's a fascinating idea where, like, on one hand, like, because you're describing, to me at least, these kind of two, in a way, opposing ideas. On one hand, the overarching idea is Dir b'tachtonim, Hafatzas Mayonis, Tachlis, serving God, in other words, right? But on the other hand, there is this idea that you have to respect poetry for poetry. In a way, the only way you can use it is by not using it. Right, like the only way that you can gain from not
taking advantage of it.
Right, yeah. the only way that you can be successful is in a way by risking a lot on the going in, right? Like if that's what I was pushing at earlier or asking about earlier, where. When you write a poem, especially about many of the topics that you write, you're incurring tremendous risk in the sense that you cannot like source it and say, oh, this line or these ideas are found in this sefer. No, like maybe there is an idea that connects to a sefer, but the words that I'm using here are my words, and like you said, I may make a real error here, but this is my best attempt at it, right? And that's the only way it works. Like the only way it works is by being open to the possibility that it doesn't work at all. And I think that I think that kind of is an idea that's much bigger than just poetry. Just in general, it's like you talk about Dir b'tachtonim. It's just in general, I think about Avodas Hashem, right? Where there is this tension between knowing that I'm doing the right thing, the safety in knowing that I'm doing the right thing, and also being honest about where I am now and what working with myself, working with my nefesh Bahamas is nasty and risky business. That's the whole point, right? And if you're not ready to make a mistake, you're not going to get anywhere.
Right? Yeah. No, I agree with that. It reminds me of the sikha about Chavivin Alayim Nikol, that the mirrors were the most precious.
Oh yes,
to Hashem.
you're talking about the Mars.
Yeah.
The Mars service. Yeah, it was just in Terror by Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just in Terror and Hanukkah, and what's really interesting is that the Rashi there, as Moshe Rabbeinu said, I don't want it.
Right.
I don't want it. That's from the Medrashim, I think, but I don't. It doesn't belong here. I don't think it belongs here, right? Like they're and now that we're having this conversation, I'm thinking, we were talking earlier about the parameters of the mimer. Moshe Rabbeinu, he was Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Like, we're not smarter than Moshe Rabbeinu. Right. So why didn't he see in it what makes so much sense to us?
Yes, right.
Because Moshe Rabbeinu in his parameters, maybe there was no place for the Marasid service in the Mishkan, right? Maybe Moshe Rabbeinu is Ar Yashar, and what he sees through everything, and he doesn't want to dwell on what those mirrors reflect and what the memories that they bring up, and he can see past it, and so but that's Moshe Rabbeinu, right? That's the mimer, but. I think there are parameters here. It's too much.
No, I agree with you, but it makes me think also about Asay L'Charav.
Right.
Like, I know that I'm pushing the envelope a little bit.
Right.
And there's a fine line. In fact, my second book was very personal.
Right.
About my family. And I think it's important to say that I didn't really have a choice to write the poems or not. I feel like a poem chooses me more than I choose the poem. I'm not in control of, I'm not the kind of poet or writer who could say, I would like to write about this topic and sit down and write about it. I don't, that's not how I write. I write more by what I'm moved by.
Right.
And often, so if there's something emotional happening in my life, in my family life, I'll write about that. And that's the only way I could write from an authentic place. And I think that's often the only way the poem is going to be successful, to some degree, some kinds of poems at least. So then it became a question. I had all these poems about my family, and it became a question as to whether that's appropriate to publish that material. So I think for a chassid, in those kind of situations, it's important to have like a mashpia.
Right.
You're a human being, and you're flawed and imperfect, and you go through these experiences and you respond like a human being. And in my case, I wrote these poems. And then I think as a chassid, you have to ask a mentor, is it appropriate to publish this? And that's what I did. And my mentor said, the one who has to make that choice is your wife. And again, it's not like I could have written other poems that I had, and I just could have put a different book out. It doesn't work that way for me. I could only write these poems, and there weren't that many of them. And if I was going to publish a book, it would have to be those poems or no book. So, and that would be hard. It would be hard to have no book, but I accepted that maybe that's the right thing. And my wife is a wonderful person, very supportive, said that I should publish them. And then I went forward and published them. And one of the thinking is that these are poems about hardships, in difficult times, but maybe they could help somebody who's going through those same experiences. And if so, maybe that it's worth it. And then, retroactively, I could say, maybe if it does help people, and it's a poem about going through difficult times and persevering, then maybe that is a documentation of his Dir B'Tachtonim experience. And I would say also that my lifestyle itself is a commentary. So I could write a poem about having a difficulty in life, or maybe even having a difficulty with faith, but my lifestyle itself is a commentary. Ultimately, I hope that I was able to surmount that, right, even if the poem doesn't say that I did.
Right. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. That's the space that literature fills.
Right. Literature has to be human and it has to take risks. Otherwise, it's going to fall flat.
Otherwise, it's a fairy tale.
But in my mind, and maybe I'm wrong, in my mind, that is, Bishvili Nivra HaHelem. You have the Helem. God designed it specifically for you.
Right.
You're going through it. Okay, people nobody should necessarily air any personal dirty laundry. Sure. You have to have discretion. And I think that's where it becomes a point where you there's a gray area. And that's why I say l'charav. When you're not sure, you're not objective. Ask somebody who you trust to get a second opinion.
Right.
And I feel if I asked a mashpia and they told me to do it, then I was doing what the Rebbe wanted.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, if I asked a mashpia and they said, don't do this, and I said, no, my career, I have to, then I think that would not be what the Rebbe wanted. Right. So in the end, that's all a person could do. A person is a human being. They're subjective and flawed and vulnerable. I think that's why it is important to have a mashpia, a seilach or a stalik ben safek. So I remember, in Tiferes, Rebbe Wagner said, if your mashpia tells you something, that's God saying it. Now, of course, you can have different mashpias, or you don't like your mashpia, you can switch to a different one. But that is it's a Pirkei Avos.
Right.
It's Torah. So, and many times in my life, I feel like sometimes I'm in unique situations.
Does your mashpia understand poetry? I'm not trying to figure out who it is.
But... the person that I asked this question, yes, I think so, for sure, for sure. And there's been times where some people said, "Why don't you work on a translation to the Friedrich Rebbe Sichos?" And I asked my mashpia, and they said, "No, you have to go much farther down. You have to go down real tachta. That's not, So, and I like that advice.
I like it too.
It's a good advice. So yeah, I think you're not alone. That's the thing to know. You're not alone, and you're not just making these decisions like you're on an island.
Right.
The Rebbe set up a system for us, and it's crystal clear. And you have to find a person who will understand where you're coming from. I think a lot of times I'm in unique waters,
right? Because
I'm in this situation, the poetry world, and as a professor and things like that. You have to find somebody who you feel has a broad enough perspective to see the bigger picture.
Right.
But I think that so many times in my life I said, well, thank God I have a mashpia that I could ask. Right. I'm not alone.
Right.
And that's one of the really beautiful things that the Rebbe set up, I think.
I mean, it's so interesting how you're, this theme of you're not alone. That's the idea. You explained that's one of the reasons you feel you write poetry, so people, or you publish certain poems, so that other people shouldn't feel alone. But like you're saying, it makes sense in a way that you cannot make people feel not alone if you feel alone yourself, right? And so the way you don't feel alone is by having this sense of connection and the sense of guidance. It's very interesting how, a lot of times, and I'm not discounting it completely, but a lot of times the mashpia is seen as this kind of Kabbalah's oil. Like I need someone who gives me orders, and you're also framing it as a kind of connection, or the opposite of isolation, the opposite of alienation. And
Well, because his suffix is so
correct. I agree with
it's so
it.
painful.
I agree with it. No, I agree with it. There's no lonelier place than being in doubt, right? Because it's on you to figure that one out. It's your doubt, and you're kind of in that corner yourself, and having that person to guide you is immensely helpful. I just wanted to, before we get to your poems, I've been this has been sitting on my head the whole time. The story of your conversation keeps reminding me of the story of Reb Hillel Parcher. I'm sure you know. I think it's Reb Hillel Parcher, who I think he was a chossid of, I think, 3 Rebbeim, but so I don't know which Rebbe this was with, but he heard a mimer, and then there was later he heard a mimer from the Rebbe, and then he had his own chazar of the mimer, and there was I don't know if it was with him and the Rebbe or one of the Rebbe's sons. I think it was with the Rebbe. Like, that's not how I said the mimer. He said, but that's how I heard it. This is, my version of the mimer may not be the way you said it, but it's the way I heard it, and that's also real, right? And when you said that story of the person doesn't take your book into the bathroom, that's what it reminded me of, that where, like, it may not be what's said in the mimer, but that's how you heard it, and that in itself is a kind of terror, right? Like, there is that. It's a very interesting kind of space, because there is, at the end of the day, the mimer is the mimer, right? We're not trying to kind of dilute it, and this is the Oishis Harav. When your Chazer mimer is supposed to say it the way it was said, there was a lot of dedication paid to getting it right.
Idea that you have the Mishkan the way that it's told to Moshe and that's commanded, is Shema of Atzilus, and then you have the Mishkan the way that the construction workers are making it.
Right.
And it's not transcendent and spiritual. It's a little messy.
Right.
But that's the ultimate tafkid.
That is the Mishkan.
The tachlis,
that is the Mishkan, and it's just as holy.
It's more. That's the tachlis. The other Mishkan.
Right. So it's just a really interesting. It's and then people want, but where's the source for this? Where's the source for this idea that you have? It's like, no, that's the whole point. There isn't one. I may be wrong.
Right.
I may be wrong. I actually, I was thinking about it by Yutas Kislev bringing this year. And I was like, maybe it's because everybody has a smartphone in their pocket, or maybe just because I'm jaded personally and I'm kind of annoyed just hearing the same thing again and again. But it's like, I don't need to hear from you something that I could Google or I could have read. Tell me something, like the way
filter
I
through
define
your
it.
own human idiosyncratic.
Tell me something on your heart, and
Right.
the way I put it, tell me something on your heart. Tell me something that might get you in trouble.
Right. Earlier, I was going to say, actually, if I had to find a parallel between poetry and an aspect of Chassidic life, for me, sometimes I feel that the space that I could inhabit in writing a poem is similar to a space of a Farbrengen.
Like
It's a space of truth, of truth-telling, of honesty.
Right.
For me, at least, it can mean something different for many different people.
Right.
There's many different poets writing many different kinds of poetry, but I do feel that it's like inhabiting a similar space of authenticity and truth. When a poem is working, and I'm telling the truth, I mean a deep emotional truth, it does feel similar to kind of a vulnerability expressed in a Farbrengen.
Right. All right, so let's get to some of your poems. So we were discussing earlier. I think we should begin with that poem about being the troubles of being a Jewish poet.
All right, this poem is I wrote. It's in my first book, so it's probably written more than 15 years ago. Okay, so it's called The Jewish Poet. It is hard to be a Jewish poet. You cannot say things about God that will offend the disbelievers. And you always have to remind someone it wasn't your people who killed their Savior. And Solomon and David are always laughing over your shoulder, like a father and son ridiculing the unfavored brother. And you cannot entice people with the sloping parts of a woman's body, because you must always remain pure. And every day you have to ask yourself why you're writing when there is already the one great book. it's hard to be a Jewish poet. You cannot say anything about the disbelievers which might offend God.
So very much what we've been talking about. Very much what we've been talking about. The
I think that those anxieties that I had, 14 years ago, 15 years ago, I don't necessarily have anymore.
Really?
To the same extent, those were something that I think really this poem I wrote. You have to ask yourself why you're writing when there's already the one great book. I remember being in graduate school and writing poetry, and then encountering Chassidus and feeling like there was almost no point to write because I'm studying the secrets of the universe.
Right.
So what could I personally add?
Right.
Was my thought. You're studying about I never heard of the Dalit Olamos,
Right.
I never heard of, Atzilus, and then all of a sudden you hear that there's Atzilus, and there's 4 worlds, what am I supposed to say?
Right.
So I had that feeling, but I think this really speaks to what you were saying. It's not, I'm not supposed to write another, Torah Chadasha. That's not what my point is. I'm supposed to write about my experience as a Jew,
Right.
and that is, again, I feel like is a documentation of the Dir B'Tachtonim,
Right.
what it looks like. It's not my job to. I previously felt intimidated. What could I contribute? What can I say? And it not only is it not my job, but that's the whole point. The whole point of a Torah is so that we can make a Dir B'Tachtonim.
Right.
So you have to write the poem.
Right. Yeah, isn't that, so much of Chassidus, the way you're framing it now, is such a beautiful way of how Chassidus wrestles with, which one comes first. There's, is it Torah or Bnei Yisrael, right? And in a way it's
or even the Neshama and the Guf.
Right, but in a way it's symbiotic, where it depends how, both in a way, right? But there's this idea where the way that Torah reaches the world is through the neshama, right? The only way that these ideas of Torah permeate the world is through the person who wrestles with them.
Right. But really,
that self is Torah.
But really, the Bnei Yisrael was before the Torah.
Right, on a different level, right? But I'm saying here you're talking about how Torah has to come through the persons.
Right.
So it's very interesting. So let's jump a little bit around in the poetry. Maybe we should have began with this, but here's what it is. There's a poem. Is it in your second book, the one about the light in the lamppost?
Yeah, that's in my second book. Yeah, my wife doesn't actually like when I read this one, but
she doesn't listen to the podcast.
Okay, this one, yeah.
This is one.
Okay, this is called "You Stood Beneath the Streetlight Waving Goodbye."
And when was this written?
This was probably written maybe 12 years ago, 13 years ago.
Also a while ago.
Yeah, because what happens is you write your poems, and then you need to amass enough poems to come up with a book. So that could take a while, and then it takes a while for the book to be edited and published. So you could end up with poems in the book that could even be 10 years, that you wrote 10 years earlier.
Right.
My first book, I wrote most of those poems in graduate school, actually.
Right.
So, okay. Called "You Stood Beneath the Streetlight Waving Goodbye." You stood beneath a streetlight waving goodbye the night we dropped you off in the city for our daughter's appointment with one of the country's top surgeons. And as we drove away, the other children and I waved back at you until, because of the angle in the distance, your forms disappeared in the light. And I remembered how, in college, I would turn back each evening as I stepped out of your apartment building. You would poke your young, beautiful face out the second-story window, your arm cutting the cool night air as you waved goodbye. And I would walk backwards over the frosted grass until I reached halfway beyond the next building, where each time, from that distance, I watched the street lamp's light suddenly consume your dark arm and face. The mystics say creation begins as a luminescent point, a flash of wisdom containing all that will be, but in an abstract, potential form. All those nights when we were so young, when your body became a ray of light, I could not have imagined the life that lay ahead of us a decade later. 2 boys and 2 girls, one who cannot hear, all of us in a small apartment, each with needs as enormous as mansions. Sometimes I'm afraid you will wave goodbye and turn away from our life together, that a man who can make things easier has been waiting ever since the mystic's luminescent flash, growing ever more real and hungry for you until one day he will materialize as you load groceries into the van. I would like to go back to the young woman waving at the window to the man walking backwards. I would like to show her this life, to say she is free to go, and to ask her if she will still take me.
It gets to you even 14 years later, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it's very personal. Yeah, it's, you even if you decide that you're going to publish something, you still question, in the aftermath. I actually remember reading this book like a couple of years ago, and then I was like, wow, I can't believe I wrote this, and I can't believe I published it, and even though I spoke about it and I deliberated over it, also what happens is that when you're writing a poem and you're editing it and you're reading it over so many times, you kind of get distant from the emotion entailed in the poem.
Right.
It almost becomes a separate entity. And you don't even realize, you lose a sense of the gravity of what the poem is doing and what it means and how somebody else might process it. That's why it's shocking when you encounter a reader and they tell you that they're moved by your work.
But I find that poem so touching. I don't find that poem I mean, obviously it's easy for me to say, but I don't find it like embarrassing or disparaging or somehow like look at like. It's real. It's real.
Yeah.
I mean, I read it years ago, and I remember it to this day. It's like what do you find? Like, what is it just that it's so personal, or is there something in there that you feel is a little bit on the edge?
I guess it's personal. I mean, yeah, it's personal. It's speaking about life's challenges in a very open way,
right?
Which some people, don't want to do. And
that's their problem.
Well, yeah, that's true. But I look, every writer, even if they're not from, they have this dilemma: how much of my family's life can I write about?
I see.
Every writer has that dilemma, and in the frum world, you probably have it even more.
But why is that? Because like when you read this poem, and there are other poems of yours that I suppose we could say are a little bit more risque. More risque.
Yeah. No, I don't think this
is not risque.
I don't think this poem is risque.
This is about at least to me, contrasting lived experienced life versus the kind of naive, innocent, marry me, like everything's gonna be great.
Yeah, that's true. I
mean, it's just life.
Right. It's just the stuff of life. Yeah. And if, I mean, I guess when I read that poem, what I think it's about, I think it's like about trying to show affection towards my wife, and saying, even after all the life that we've had, I hope that you would still want to continue, if you had a choice to do it all over again.
That's such a beautiful. No, that's. I mean, I'm not a very emotional guy, at least not outwardly, but it's so touching. Like, isn't that what we all wonder all the time? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm sharing too much myself now, but isn't that what we all wonder all the time? That like, I hope that our hope is that everything that turned out, and all the successes and disappointments, that we would still do it all over again together. Isn't that the ultimate?
Yeah.
Isn't that the ultimate testament to to a relationship.
Yeah, but I guess it's tinged with sadness. The poem. My wife doesn't like when I read. If I'm at a reading and she doesn't like when I read that poem.
I'm sure being so. I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for her. I don't know. I mean, I understand. I don't take it for granted that you publish it. I understand why you would not publish it.
I think also part of me is in this poetry world where people are writing much more provocative things that are pushing the envelope to such a degree that I maybe don't even have a sense of scale,
But in a way, those kind of poems, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but things have gotten so like open, where in a way, when you don't hide anything, it actually doesn't. To me, at least, it's not provocative at all.
Right, it's just like over the top. Yeah, it's
just like everything.
Poor taste.
It cheapens everything.
Right,
like if there's nothing that you're concealing,
right,
then almost nothing. Like at least in filming, there's this idea that you always want to, you want to film into shadow, right? You want the light to be behind the shadow as opposed to the shadow behind the light. You want to draw people in with what's behind. Not what's not bring everything to the surface.
Right.
Like leave some stuff to be concealed.
Some implication, something elliptical.
Yes, give layers. There's there's concealment, there's revelation, and so on. It's a beautiful poem. There was another poem, and by the way, if there's any ones that you want to share, please feel free. There's another one though that's one that sticks out of my mind about the immigrant. Is that from your first or second book?
That's in the back of my second book. Yeah, that's called the Soul in a Body. It's very short.
Yes.
The Soul in a Body. The soul in a body is like an old Russian immigrant looking out his apartment's only window. Yes, he says. The landlord printed my name in block letters on the lobby directory decades ago. All correspondence has been forwarded to this address. But I am not from here. I am not from here at all.
I like that one a lot.
Should I read one more like directly incorporating Chassidus?
Yeah, sure.
Just to see the kind of difference, maybe. I'll read two of them. So one.
But before you go to the next one, that one, for example, the neshama in the body, right? Right. To me, that's a beautiful. You don't really cite a source. You don't cite a text. You have this beautiful. It's an image that stuck with me for a while. Where like this, the immigrant and the sense of place, or the sense of homesickness almost. Which kind of fits his
I guess I thought probably...
Where did it come from? Like, how does that work?
Maybe that's... I don't know. Sometimes a poem just starts with an image. I just thought, like, you look at, like, the mailboxes in an apartment, you see, like, these kind of block letters and the sticker. It kind of is a striking, strange image, which is the person's name, but it also feels like kind of anonymous and...
Right.
But it probably comes from, like, the ideas of Chassidus, like the way that the Rebbe... reads the Mishnah Al Korchat Achai,
right?
Al Korchat Ameis, that the neshama doesn't really want to come down here,
right?
And it does, and in fact, if the neshama is to be successful here in making the dir b'tachtonim in to mavar the guf, it can't feel at home,
right?
So, but because there's the etzem neshama and it's a soldier, it still will come down anyway. Right? It's against the teva of the neshama, but it will do it anyway. And it needs to constantly feel like it's not at home, or like in Love and Garti, also.
No, the idea resonates with me, so you had this image, and you're like something clicks in your mind.
I'm sure that I was I can't remember exactly when writing that poem, but that whole concept, even just thinking about a soul and a body, is something that you're going to do when you learn a lot of Chassidus.
Right, but did that start with the idea, or did it start with the image, with the feeling?
I'm not sure. I can't really remember. But I think in a life...
It doesn't feel like it started with an idea.
In a life, you're a person is constituted of all the things that they're learning and all the things that they're seeing. And then it kind of just weaves together probably. And then you sit down to write. Hopefully, if you learn Chassidus, it becomes the part of the way that you look at things, right?
Right.
And then when you kind of analyze a situation or think about a situation, you might think about it through that lens.
Right.
I,
It
yeah,
definitely doesn't feel like you were, like you talked earlier about meaning versus being. It definitely
right.
doesn't feel like I have this concept of neshama beguf. How do I
How do I
how do
share
I
it?
how do I
share it?
like find a
Right.
it feels real. It feels
Right,
like
right.
I feel that guy, that immigrant who's frustrated that like this is my home but it totally isn't.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is especially true if you're trying to write, let's say, for a secular audience. You definitely can't lecture to them. The secular audiences already think people of faith are overly simplistic and that have all the answers.
Right.
I think that's probably also partly why a lot of the poems do invite experiences shrouded in doubt or challenges and difficulty. Maybe part of it is I'm writing for a larger audience, and I want them to know maybe that just because you're a religious person doesn't mean that life is simple or easy, or you even have all the answers.
That's interesting. You feel that if you were writing for a religious audience, you would be less open
It
about your
might be.
doubts?
It might be. It might be the case.
Religious people don't have doubts?
They do. But I might, maybe if I thought of, who am I writing for? If I thought I'm writing for, it might be if I thought I'm just writing for other frum people, maybe it would be more like, just kind of like parsha poems and like just kind of like capture chassidus. But I don't know why that is, but it might be.
Yeah, but exactly
be the case.
Why? I mean, like
because that look, I think that is
from people. You think from people like
one of the reasons why I'm also not quite as afraid to share some of these things is because I think that the people that would be offended by it are not going to be picking the book up anyway.
Right. I mean, fair enough. Fair enough. But like
when is the Rosh Hashiva? How many Rosh Hashivas going to like?
Yeah, but I don't know.
But yeah, he shouldn't. That's not a good logic. He's not. You shouldn't write poems because because the Rosh Hashiva will not look at it.
I just look. On one hand, there's always the argument. Well, if they're frums, obviously, in terms of being frum and religiosity, something's working because they are religious. Like if the goal is to be an observant Jew, then the fact that they're observant means that it's working this way. But I think that we have to be able to be honest and see past the surface. That there are many people, and I'm not saying every person who's religious is struggling with something, but there are many people who look observant and are observant. They're not faking it. They're not liars. Right. They're not fake, but you go underneath, and not that you have to like feed them with questions and kind of entice them with, but you're talking to real things that go on. Like
they don't have to put effort.
Look, this podcast,
that's what Alter is saying. Like a person who gets upset that he had a machshava zara is somebody who's overestimating himself.
Precisely,
right?
precisely. We're human. Look.
Yeah.
This podcast is is meant for other, mostly from people or Lubavitchers, and the resonance. A lot of people disagree with a lot of the things that I say or others say, and that's perfectly fine. If anything, that's hopefully what happens. You don't want people that disagree with everything, that agree with everything that you say, but people would be shocked to hear who's listening into these conversations. It's not just people on the fringes. It's not just people that are, quote unquote open-minded, asking questions. It's people in the privacy of their house where no one's judging them for what they're reading or listening. People are going through these kind of questions or trying to find a feeling like, what does it mean to, in the case of that, the poem that you read a little bit ago, what does it mean to love my wife, to love my, for a woman to love her husband, even though we've been through so much? What does it mean to commit to a life where we actually know the price of that commitment? It's not just innocent bliss, right? What does that mean? People are at home asking that question. I'm very lucky that in my work I get to meet people of all kinds and tell their stories or listen to their stories. And these things are very real. And very often it's people that are very religious who are going through, there may be a little bit different language and a different way of presenting it, but it's very real. So, I can sympathize with the idea that if it was for a religious audience, you would have reason to be scared that, if the Rosh Hashivas are going to be reading it, yes, I understand the fear, but I don't think the logic, I think.
Yeah, you could, you can't, it's going to be a good poem or not, not dependent on the audience.
Right.
Yeah.
And the religious person has a need for it just as much as the other person, maybe even more, because how many other poets can he read that are at least respectful of that there is a line somewhere, and it's not a free for all.
Right. No, I mean, look, in actuality, all of the rabbis and mentors that I've encountered were supportive of me writing poetry and encouraged me to do so.
Right.
I did not encounter anybody who told me that he should not.
No, but you're talking about poetry that actually has has an edge to it, as opposed to a more. Anyway, why don't I know time is short. Why don't we make sure that we read that poem from the latest collection?
Okay, so I mean, here's a couple poems that are more like directly incorporating Chassidus, and I guess in those cases, how do you make it not like a lesson?
Right.
I don't know, maybe you have to try to incorporate humor or imagery, or again, maybe you just have to be intrigued by the idea yourself.
Right.
and then just share, this is an interesting idea that I saw. I'm not trying to shove it down your throat or I'm not trying to be pedantic or dogmatic and superimpose it on you, but it's just something interesting.
Right.
So this poem is probably it was inspired from the Rebbe Shab's V'yadaita Moscow mimer.
Ah, interesting.
Which talks about Havai and Elokim.
Sure. Tzimtzum.
And the Tzimtzum, and really how the Havai and Elokim is really both just two sides, so to speak, of Hashem, and therefore they're really one, and therefore there's no true Helam from Hashem's perspective.
Right.
So it's a lot of the poems in this book are in sections, so they're just like these small kind of different sections. In this case, I numbered them. So I'll just read it. It's called Notes on the Tzimtzum. 1. Once, on a bus from Jerusalem to Ein Gedi, I saw a man place his hand over his bare head and recite the blessing over water. 2. One can't use his hand as a head covering, the rabbis conclude, because one can't cover oneself with oneself. 3. Since the divine hand hides that everything stems out of the divine, when God looks at the world, like moss growing over moss, he sees only divinity. 4. The Jew without a yarmulke placed the cap on his water bottle and resumed watching a YouTube on black holes. 5. In this world, Hashem conceals his omnipresence, his infinite light, his power to hide, eclipsing his power to reveal. 6. In this world, we ride buses through a divine concealment whose diameter is greater than infinity. We sip water beside a dam that holds back endless light. So I just think it's a fascinating idea, a remarkable idea that, the koach of gvul, Hashem's ability to hide himself, actually is greater than the koach of bli gvul.
Right.
In order to be able to hide bli gvul, you have to be even greater than that power. You have to have something that's greater than Ein Sof even.
Right.
Which is, to me, is just a fascinating, remarkable idea. So, in a sense, just walking through a world that's the product of a Tzimtzum is actually experiencing a level of divinity that's greater than had the Tzimtzum not been.
Right.
Although there's no Giluyim by definition, there's no illumination, there's not necessarily inspiration, but you're basically walking through a reality that is a manifestation of something even greater than the Koach HaBli Gvul.
Right. I mean, that's precisely the point of that mimer, if I remember correctly. Somebody actually reached out to me recently. a listener of the podcast and had a question about V'yadaita Moskva. I don't know where on the podcast I indicated that
That you're an expert at the moment.
No, forget about expert. that I'm at all a person to ask about it. But when he asked a question, I was thinking about it. He was asking about the whole mashal of Rav and Talmud, and the point of the mimer is not to affirm that from God's perspective this world is not a stira to Zachdus. That's God's business. That makes a lot of sense in many ways, right? It's all good. The point of the mimer, at least the way I remember it, is that also from the person's perspective, from the world's perspective, in truth,
it's not really a helam.
In truth, it's not a helam. You may not see it that way, but like the Talmud, who in the mashal that he understands, there is in fact the nimshal. He may not see it, but it is there.
That's actually this year's Bosi Lgani. That's
what it's about. I haven't got.
He mentioned that idea. He mentioned that the mashal of the Rav and Talmud, and how in the mashal is really all the pratim of the nimshal.
Right. So, like, to me, that you're talking about the poem, right? It's not just that we know it to be true because as a state, this is what it says. And so we know this to be true. Okay, let's pack it up. It's like, no, it's true on our terms as well, even if we don't know it yet.
Right. It's there. It's accessible if we knew how to decode it.
Right.
And eventually we will. And we have to.
But even if you won't get to it in your lifetime, it's not a futile task, or it's not a frivolous task, because it's there.
Right.
It's there.
And also, I think it's like we've been speaking about difficult situations. I think this speaks to that also. We are in the post-Tzimtzum reality. The post-Tzimtzum reality is really a greater divine energy than the pre-Tzimtzum reality. Right. The koach of gvul is even greater. Right. The anochi haster aster. In the haster aster is the anochi.
Right.
So I think writing about human struggles seems to make sense then.
Right.
And it's trying to insist that there is the anochi in the haster aster.
Right. Provided that you struggle against a concealment, then your title of your new book, The Concealment of Endless Light. How was a poem like that, which is clearly a more Chassidic poem, how was that received by your literati audience?
I haven't heard too much, but I think it's an interesting idea. I think that people, when they learn about Chassidus, when they hear Chassidus, it's really so rich and fascinating, and intuitive and counterintuitive in ways, right? That I think is just fascinating. When I was a student, to go back to the Professor Tony Hoagland, he told me that I'm really at a great advantage over my peers because I have a very deep resource to draw upon, whereas maybe my peers are kind of adrift. They don't have a tradition necessarily. They're not invested in the tradition. So I could always tap into this kind of tradition.
That's really interesting. I mean, the famous line, I think, by Vonnegut, that literature eventually disappears up its own, what. There's something good about having an anchor outside of literature.
Outside of literature, right.
But I think there's also something very interesting where, in a way, you're saying poetry has to be about experience, right, and not about narrative. But in a way, when you're a person who learns Chassidus and tries to live Chassidus, in a way, I think the uft of Chassidus is that the meaning is the experience in a way, right? Like trying to understand V'yadaita Moskva and what Tzimtzum means, that is part of the experience. That's the whole point, right? So in a way, like that seems to be like the challenge that you're grappling with now, which is how. Not just let me talk about life and refer to Chassidus, but let me talk about Chassidus as an experience.
Right. I think I have another poem that might,
but by all means,
relate to that. Some similar concepts. Okay. So it's called Morning Prayer and the Waste Management Company, and so it takes lines from Chassidus and then parallels it, juxtaposes it with the experiences that I'm having in the moment. So it starts with the Chassidus. Did God withdraw to make room for the universe, or merely carve out an open space in his infinite light? Asked the Chassidic discourse I'd studied that morning, standing at the open window, wrapped in a prayer shawl in tefillin, when the sanitation workers arrived in their blue monogrammed overalls. The men lifted the overstuffed cans above their heads and emptied the contents. Only the light was removed, the discourse answered. God's essence is at home equally in the sacred and the profane, finite and infinite, and is, therefore, always present. The sanitation workers dropped the gray cans upside down on the muddy grass. Then, in inverted fashion, the world was created, the way the wax indents where the signet ring protrudes, and protrudes where the ring indents, the way the highest brick falls farthest from the base of the wall. That which appears ordinary, lowly, is rooted more deeply in the divine. I turned the next page in my prayer book. The sanitation workers hung on to metal handles and floated in the air.
I love that. I love that. I love the way you ended it, floated in the air. Yeah. Yeah.
So that poem kind of came about. I was like really just like davening. For whatever reason, they're diving at home.
That's it. This whole thing. Here we thought that we could trust your poetry
because I was davening in shul for so long, and I was learning Chassidus, and then shul was over, and then I came home to finish.
Rabbeinu Tams.
And I was like maybe like learning something about the idea of the chossid, the seal,
right.
and Alter Rebbe. And then like the window was open, and then all of a sudden the garbage men came, and it was just kind of it was a real tachton moment with the garbage men.
Right.
So and I guess it kind of spoke to me about like the strangeness and the absurdity of life. At a certain point, you could like think. Like the Rebbe says in the Parshas Yisro, like quoting other sources, like when you're like really immersed in Chassidus, the fact that there's a world becomes a question, and you only know that there's a world because there's a pasuk Bereshis bara Elokim.
Right.
So like if you happen to be immersed in a mimer at that moment, right?
That's all.
And then all of a sudden, and that becomes like kind of like, at least for that moment, you're really immersed in it. That's like the reality. And then all of a sudden you're jolted out of it, and you see these garbage men coming. You like maybe think of it in the context of a mimer or like
right. That's the ultimate goal, right? Is that you are so anchored in that reality that Chassidus talks about, that the only way you know for certain the world is here is because as steht in Torah, right? Like that's the only real proof that the world is here. That's how much your senses have been reoriented, like and what you know for real and not real. It's fascinating. Yeah, I mean that idea. That idea of the Seif Ma'aseh Machshavot Tchila, it was in this past week's 2 weeks ago. Yosef and Yehuda, and what I found in Torah Vayigash, and what I found fascinating about that, and I think it ties into our conversation, is that what's beautiful about that mimer is that there's Yosef. There's Joseph who represents Mamayla Lamata, or the way the world is now. Say there's Stalshlos, and there's Yehuda who represents the upside down version of it, where Daimim is higher and Malchus is higher, Eshes Chayil Teres Baila, and so on, like the Mimer explains. But in a way, at least, but the Mimer also connects the two versions of reality to the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, which to me told me, at least the way I read it was, don't think for a moment that you can discount either. Like a lot of times we say, oh, well, this is you just say there's stalshus, but really it's higher. Really the whole thing is reversed. This is just how things look, but really it's, and in a way that, that does challenge the way you look at the world, but you're just replacing one. You're replacing one hierarchy with another hierarchy. You're replacing one perspective with another perspective.
Right.
What that mimer is saying is you have to have both. You have to
Right.
you have to have both, and both live in this kind of tension with one another. And of course, that makes sense. Seder Shtalshlus is not chump change. It's a real thing, right?
Right. We were learning Pesach Eliyahu in the morning, the Rebbe's, and I was also saying that there's Das Elyon and Das Tachton,
Right,
and both
precisely.
are equally real and equally
Right.
true. They're both different sides of Hashem's Ratzon.
Right, and in a way that can cause, like in the story of Yosef and Yehuda, that can cause tremendous tension and alienation, right? Like at the end of the day, that mimer is talking about V'yigash elav Yehuda. Yehuda approaches Yosef, not knowing for a moment that he's his brother. It's a king. The ultimate alienation is that you see your brother as a king, not as a brother, or you approach your brother as a servant. Is the ultimate form of alienation, because it's very hard to hold these different truths at once, right? But in the end, that is what it is. That is what it is. Anyway, I think it's very interesting that it would connect to her that way, but I think that's very much the conversation, or at least what I'm gaining from this conversation, is that people naturally, like, this is not, I completely understand it, that people want an answer, so if it's not this way, tell me another way. If if this isn't working, give me another way that does work, right? If it's not like it says it over here, then tell me how it should, how it says it differently somewhere else. And ultimately, when you're writing poetry, or you're doing any kind of writing or any kind of creative project, there is no right answer. That's the whole point, right? You're working in between. You're working in this space where you don't have this kind of definitive answer, and you have to live with it. But ultimately, that is what makes a poem or an idea come alive, right? That ability or just insistence on not reaching for.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's why for me poetry is more enjoyable than math. There's one right answer. I think in certain ways, Chassidus, there's a pshat in the mimer,
Right.
But since what we're talking about is so abstract to us, it also has an element of subjectivity to it.
Sure.
Because people are thinking different things when they're learning these concepts, even if they're talking about the same words. Very much so, because it's so abstract.
Sure.
When you're talking about Atzilus, and so I kind of, as much as there's the osios of what the mimer says, and there's the pshat, and you could have a reading comprehension error, there always did seem to be more creativity in a mimer. Again, you can't superimpose your own understanding. That's wrong. There is misunderstanding the mimer, but the topics themselves are abstract and lend themselves to creativity, I think.
Wonderful. Anyway, thank you very much for doing this.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
This is the new collection, The Concealment of Endless Light. This is the third collection, right?
Correct. Yes.
And where do people find this?
You could get it on Amazon or at the
Amazon.
publisher orisinbooks.com.
So, The Concealment of Endless Light by Yehoshua November. I haven't read this latest one, but the first two, I can tell you that I've read, I think, all the poems in those two collections, and you won't regret it. And you don't have to be a poetry snob to appreciate it.
In fact, I've been accused of being radically clear. One time I had
how disappointing.
There was one time that I had the honor, if that's what you would call it, of having a poem published in the New York Times Sunday magazine.
Which one was that?
That one's called. Can't even remember what it's called, but
it's from the latest one?
It's in the second book, Prayer. I think it's just called Prayer. And when they introduced the poem, the author that introduced it said that my poems are radically clear.
As a pejorative?
No, I guess as a compliment, but that relative to other poetry, the poems are very clear
and
very accessible, very accessible. So that's a good point that you're making. A lot of times when they think about poetry, they're taught poetry as something that's like a riddle that you have to decode. And probably that's because they were taught whatever poetry they've encountered was poetry from like hundreds of years ago.
Right.
And the style was maybe perhaps like that, or it was just using a different kind of vernacular, different diction. But a lot of contemporary poetry is very accessible. It's almost like a story, just very compressed. So yes, I was accused of being radically clear.
So let's end off with that poem. Let's just end off with the poem with prayer. Why not? You mentioned it. Let's just end off with one last poem.
It's actually not even my favorite poem.
But you mentioned it.
Okay, I'll mention that.
If there's another one is there another one that you'd like to end off with?
No, let me end off with a different one. This one actually is about the Tree of Life shooting. I'll end with that one, and it's called "There's Only One Story." It's also in sections.
This is also in the last volume.
Yeah, this is the concealment of endless light. So it's called "There Is Only One Story" on the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. 1. There are always two stories, that of the body, that of the soul, plus the story of cousin Riva, who, arriving late that morning, was instructed by an officer to wait things out at the nearby public library. I feel guilty about not dying with my friends, she said the next day. 2. It is October 27th, 1988. My friend Robert plays wiffle ball in his backyard, a budding Tree of Life synagogue. It is October 27th, 2018. A stranger passes through unlocked double doors. Blocks away, Robert's son begins his bar mitzvah portion. Abraham inviting angels, wayfarers, into his open tent. Perhaps, Robert postulates, the soul of my recently deceased father interceded on high, causing the news to be hidden until his grandson had closed the Torah scroll. And in the afternoon, the scroll is reopened, and we read, "And Abraham came to eulogize over Sarah, and to cry for her." And according to the hidden story, the one the mystics tell, Abraham represents the soul, and Sarah the body. 3. Now it is night, half a block from the apartment where, 17 years earlier, my wife and I lived when first wed. Jews of Pittsburgh stand in the rain holding candles. 11 souls ascend to the region of mystery, then swoop down to hover incandescently over their former lives. Away from the cameras and fanfare, 11 bodies are ushered through burial rituals, pottery shards placed over 22 eyes, 11 mouths, water poured to purify physical forms that had until recently housed souls, whose last act on earth was to whisper a prayer. 4. There is only one story, say the mystics. The souls of the Jewish people throughout Jewish history form one larger body. The body bears more wounds than we want to recall. No one can explain how it limps forward, but has not faltered. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The music for this podcast comes from the album Repentant Doors by Oren Sor and Nadav Bachar and is used with their permission.